Hi guys, it's ArchieLuxury, and today I've got Timothy Kenny, and he's a specialist in accelerated learning. He has a huge following on Udemy, and he has a lot of interesting points. So I've decided to do an interview with Timothy. And let's start off. Let's start off this interview with a bit of a watch question. There, we'll start firstly. Timothy, what's your favorite watch brand and why?
So I've actually part of how I found your channel is looking up a couple questions on Patek, and that's my favorite brand by far. And I think we actually line up a lot in terms of our thoughts on things. And I like that they're family run. I like that they have that long-term perspective, and that's really gone out the window at a lot of places. So I think they have really good sense of design, and everybody knows that. So, but yeah, big into Patek, and big fan of your channel, and learned a lot from you. So it's great to be on and talk about some of the stuff that I do.
Excellent. And what is your interest in horology?
So I got into watches about 10 years ago. A mentor of mine recommended I pick up a couple issues of the wristwatch annual, the like inch or 2 inch thick catalogs that come out each year. And so I got, I think, 3 of them, and I just started going through, and there's no prices in there. So you kind of are just looking at, what do I like? What kind of speaks to me? And the classic Pateks is what really kind of, I guess I'm pretty picky because I really don't like most watches. I don't like the design of most stuff. And so it's kind of funny how that happened, but that's how I got into it. I'm also into single malt scotch and book collecting. I got into book collecting very early with one of my mentors, and different of my mentors have kind of gotten me interested in each of these things. So yeah, that's kind of, there's kind of similarities to each of them, and I've seen some of the scotch stuff that you have in your backgrounds and some of your videos. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. And then over the summer, I was just looking some stuff up, and saw some of your videos and kind of went down the rabbit hole.
No worries. How did you get started in accelerated learning and the productivity space?
Yeah, so I was going to college, and I was actually in high school, but I'd, all lined up to go to college at Tufts. And I started reading the 4 Hour Work Week, which had just come out. And I was thinking about, what are the big idea there was that you could work from your laptop, you could work from anywhere around the world. And I didn't know what kind of business I could do. So what I decided to do instead is to kind of zoom out and think meta and think, what could I want to learn business, and I want to learn the skills, kind of give myself an MBA, but an MBA that's really not a traditional MBA, but focused specifically on how do you make money online. And then once I find the right, or a 4 Hour Work Week type business. So there's a fair amount of leeway there in terms of how you can do it. So, but that just gives you that lifestyle to be able to not have a regular 9 to 5. So that's what I knew I wanted to do. I didn't know what the business was going to be. And so I decided to go head first into reading business books, watching videos online, stuff like that. And I quickly found that I was reading books and not retaining. And there was a specific thing that happened where I was at a conference, and it was a small group of people, and we were all talking about just different books we had just read. And somebody asked me about this book I was reading, and there's kind of this runner's high that you get after you read a book where you feel like you've downloaded all the information into your head. And the person asked me, what are 2 or 3 of the top things you got from the book? And my mind just went blank. There wasn't a single, like, for whatever reason, my brain wasn't clicking. And I realized, wow, there's something really off here, because I thought I really knew it. And I did kind of have a feel for things. There is tacit knowledge there. But there was something missing where I wasn't actually extracting the value from the course. And so, the book. And so I was thinking, okay, something's really wrong here. And I needed to figure out a process, because I had a process in school where I was more of the, let me cram for this, take this test, do well on it, move on to the next thing, or let me prepare for the SAT, memorize all these words, get all this stuff. And I was good at playing that game. But in the real world, you're usually playing a very different game, where it's about long-term retention. You're playing a game of decades of your career. And especially if you're in business, you need to retain all this stuff, like especially these business principles. You're going to be using this for the next 40, 50 years. So, okay, I need to think and kind of do a complete paradigm shift here of how am I going to do this so that I'm not just cramming for a test, but I'm retaining this for decades. And I'm kind of building this business foundation of knowledge. How do I retain all that? So that's, so I thought, like, I'm just going to take a month and I'm going to step away from doing this kind of personal MBA. Josh Kaufman, who I actually interviewed a long time ago about this, he wrote the personal MBA book, which is pretty good. And also the First 20 Hours, which is his book on accelerated learning. So I said, I'll take a month-long break from giving myself this education into business and instead figure out, okay, how do you learn? How do you take notes? What are even the skill? How do you decompose the skills of learning into different things? So I kind of came up with, okay, I had heard of speed reading before. People have heard of, like, JFK was a speed reader and other people, speed readers. So I thought, okay, I need to figure out, is speed reading real? How do you do it? I'll get that. And then, okay, I'm going to have to probably take notes from the book, because otherwise, how am I going to just keep rereading it? What's the process there? And then how do I memorize it? So how does memory work? I discovered stuff like spaced repetition. So those were kind of the 3 pillars. And I thought, okay, so these are my 3 pillars, and I'm going to now go back to business and continue learning the skills. And kind of, I believe luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So I figured, okay, I'm going to get myself very prepared, and then I'll be ready when I see an opportunity. And then I had this eureka moment where I was like, wow, this stuff, just putting together, I'd gone through all these books, all these courses, all these articles on the web, and kind of summarized and synthesized the best stuff I could find on each of these topics. And I thought, the stuff that I just have right here is better than 80 or 90% of what's out there. So maybe this could actually be my first product, and let me just put it out there and see what happens. So you mentioned Udemy before. Udemy is kind of where I got started. So I did write a book called Accelerated Learning for Entrepreneurs almost 10 years ago now. Could have been more than 10 years actually, but around that time I was into Skillshare when it was still in-person teaching. So I did that, and then I got into Udemy, and that was around the time that Skillshare switched from in-person to online only. And I was one of the first there. And then through Udemy, I just really hit traction, and I now have over 130,000 students there. I've taken some courses down. It used to be over 140,000, something like 40 or 50 courses up there. At the highest point, there were 70 or 80 courses. Pretty sure it's like 4,500 or 5,000 reviews. So I just really hit traction on Udemy, and I kind of realized, wow, this is something where I can actually make money and do this full time. And that's kind of the story. So, and I've since then expanded and teach other stuff within the productivity space of time management, planning, and organizing. And these were also things just as a beginning entrepreneur, I need a system for planning my day because I don't have a 9 to 5. So I need some structure. And
Yep.
then same thing
Yep.
with organizing my files. Like, how do I need some kind of system for this. So I was literally just creating systems for myself and then saying, hey, this is better than a lot of the books and courses I just went through. Let me create
Yep.
something on this, put it up and see what people think. And it took off like a rocket.
Mm. So, so as you've mentioned there, people would have seen some of your work on Udemy.
Yeah. Udemy. So Udemy.
Okay, Udemy. Um, what are some of your major accomplishments that you've achieved there?
So I'd say the biggest ones are just those numbers on Udemy because I really wasn't expecting that. And then bringing just some of the people that I've met. So people will send me private messages or email me. I then got into coaching several years ago where I started coaching people on this stuff. And more recently, I started coaching doctors and lawyers. So I was thinking about doing a test prep thing for kind of helping people review for the bar exam for lawyers, and then for doctors the step one, because I have this thing where people can kind of message me and say, hey, here's what I'm using this course for. And so people were telling me, oh, I'm preparing for my bar thing, or I'm preparing for step one. And so I put out a message and said, hey, I'll coach you for free if you're a doctor or a lawyer, and I'll help you prepare for your exam. And then I used that to create a core. I'm working on the one for lawyers. I started with the doctor one, and that did quite well on Udemy as well. The other thing with the doctor thing is that I read this story from Tiger Woods where he got to a point where he wanted to kind of challenge himself in another way, and he ended up doing some. He ended up. I think this is how he hurt his knee. Or his foot, but I think it was his knee, as he went and trained with the Navy SEALs. And the part of the Navy SEALs training is this thing called Hell Week. And the more I learned about what these doctors go through to prepare for the USMLE Step 1, basically, this is the test that you take after your first 2 years of med school. And it's kind of like the SATs or, GSCEs, or there's different in different countries, but basically it's that big standardized test you take that's going to determine where you get to go, where for doctors, their residency. So that's like the first hospital they go to once they graduate med school. So they want to get into a really good hospital, and like that'll set them up for the rest of their life if they can get into like an Ivy League level hospital. So they want to score really well on this. They actually just, I think, in the last month or two, the LSAT was made pass fail, and some of the schools aren't requiring it anymore. I think Harvard and Yale just announced something. There's kind of a conflict with the U.S. News rankings of colleges, and so and step one was made pass fail, I think, a year or two ago. They're experimenting with it. So things have kind of, some of these big top schools are moving away from standardized testing and focusing on other stuff, which there is an interesting argument for, because like this analogy with the Navy SEALs, what these med school students end up doing, because it's graded on a curve, so it's not about how objectively well you do, it's about how do you do compared to other students. So if other students go from studying 5 hours a day to 8 hours a day, you need to go to 9 hours a day, and it's like an escalating thing. So it can get extremely intense. And basically what I wanted to do is say, okay, how can I challenge myself to do the most difficult, like who are the students who are doing the most challenging learning thing in the world? And I thought med school students, it was just kind of a hunch, but med school students going in, taking this step one test. So I created a course for it, which you can see, it's up on Udemy, but I worked with these med students, and really figured out how the whole thing works. And there's a lot of strategies they use that are barely used anywhere else. For example, they use flashcards in this program called Anki or Anki. It first became popular studying Japanese and learning vocabulary and stuff like that, and then it diffused out into learning foreign languages in general. And it basically stayed there. And then med school students started using it 5 to 10 years ago. And it's mostly stayed just within the med school community, where you barely would have ever heard about this. But because it's so competitive, that thing with spaced repetition and the amount of stuff you have to memorize, it really pushed innovation within this sphere. And Ali Abdal is one of the biggest YouTubers in the productivity and accelerated learning space. He's got like 3 some million subscribers on his channel. And he was big in kind of mainstreaming a lot of this stuff 2, 3, 4 years ago. So he was at, I believe, Oxford Medical School, and he was one of the top students there. And he started teaching and sharing through YouTube some of these top strategies for how med school students study. And what some of these students had started to do it, because like part of what they have to do to get into these top school hospitals, residencies, is they have to do some kind of research. So some of these people started researching kind of at a scientific level and publishing it in medical journals, how med school students are studying and which learning strategies are correlated with the highest scores on the test. And there's a lot of just interesting things about the medical school and medical community, where these reports are put out each year on the step 1. And like, based on what score you get, this is what specialties you can go into. And there's certain specialties like dermatology, for example, which is basically a 9 to 5, pretty cushy, makes a lot of money. So you need to get a higher score to be able to get that specialty, especially if you want to go to a good residency. So there's this whole game where you're going to make a lot of money. You have to memorize a huge mountain of stuff. It's in a compressed time environment. Everybody's kind of studying the same stuff, so it's very standardized. So it's the perfect environment, kind of like UFC. What's interesting about UFC is until UFC came out, nobody really knew what was the best martial art. And you could go to any school and they'd say, oh yeah, our school is the best school. And it was hard to really prove that. But now we can kind of see like jujitsu has really gained prominence because it's been shown to be a dominant school within martial arts. So same kind of thing where you have a nice kind of a competitive environment like that, and you can measure stuff. You can see which techniques really give you the best bang for your buck, and you have this standardized way of measuring it. And so I learned a lot from doing that and helping these med students, and since then following through with them into their careers. And these are surgeons, these are radiologists, these are neurosurgeons. These are not kind of just GP type stuff. It's people who are in competitive areas. So that was major. And I got the idea from that from Scott H. Young, who's another big guy in the accelerated learning productivity space. He did a number of challenges himself, which is kind of how I got this idea. He has one, he's most well known actually for his MIT challenge. So what he did is he took he took all the required courses that you need to take over 4 years at MIT to get a computer science degree. And he said, I'm going to study like 40, 50, 60 hours a week and see if I can go through the edX MIT open online courseware program and go through the entire computer science curriculum in a single year. And he documented it all, did video journals on YouTube, made a bunch of posts on his website, and you can go see all of it. He took the tests and he uploaded them and he scored them. So he did that. And I always thought, it'd be cool to do something kind of like that. And he also did something where he traveled to 4 different countries, and learned the language and spoke only in those languages for 3 months for each of the 4 countries. And so I wanted to do something kind of like that. And so the doctor and lawyer thing was kind of like that. And so I've now taken all of that stuff and kind of put it into my materials. And so that's in terms of challenges, those are
Mm-hmm.
some of the key things.
Mm. Let me ask you, how do you think about productivity and the value of time?
Yeah, so I think one kind of it's not something I've ever heard you talk about, and
Mm-hmm.
or really anybody talk about in terms of watches,
Mm-hmm.
but I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the values of having a nice watch is it's kind of a reminder of what your time is worth, and
Mm-hmm.
make sure that as you become more successful, you're not spending time on things that other people could be doing, and you're
Mm-hmm.
instead spending times on things that uh, are the best use of your time and
Mm-hmm.
putting you in the flow, allowing you to be
Mm-hmm.
creative and kind of move to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so probably something that's a little bit counterintuitive with how I think about productivity is that uh, my whole thing is creativity. And with all
Mm-hmm.
the different courses that I've put out, like a lot of what I'm doing is really taking the things that I need to figure out in my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just turn that into a course and share that with other people. And it just
Yeah.
consistently does well. So that's why I've put out this amount of stuff is it's just solving my own problem and then sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the productivity, kind of the three pillars of what I do,
Mm-hmm.
accelerated learning is just really productivity applied to learning. So
Mm-hmm.
you can apply these principles to anything, but how do you apply it to learning? That's the first thing. And then time
Mm-hmm.
management. So just,
Mm-hmm.
David Allen getting things done. How do you plan stuff out?
Mm-hmm.
What I said earlier about Patek, I'd say my most unique thing is that I focus on very long term planning. So
Mm-hmm.
strategic planning, 5, 10,
Mm-hmm.
50, 100 years, multi generational,
Mm-hmm.
almost taking kind of a wealth management perspective on
Mm-hmm.
you have your money and you manage that and you think about that long term and your retirement and your investments and
Mm-hmm.
passing things on to next generations. But you also have the other types of capital, and your knowledge capital is a key piece of things. The fifth principle, which I think came out in the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
was all about companies going through the information revolution and realizing, hey, a big thing that we're not counting on our balance sheet is the value of our information, the value of our knowledge. And
Mm-hmm.
so part of what I see about what I'm doing is kind of taking that
Mm-hmm.
thinking, but applying it to individuals and families where
Mm-hmm.
uh, you're thinking about, how can you help your kids with their education and giving
Sure.
them these kind of uh, little productivity hacks. And this is one of the things that
Mm-hmm.
explains why parents who are professionals or who went through college or got various graduate degrees or stuff like that, they tend to pass down a lot of these little hacks that they learned to their
Mm-hmm.
kids, and then their kids do better because of that. And they help
Mm-hmm.
their kids with their homework, and through that, they're teaching them these various strategies. And so some people just don't get that growing up. You generally
Mm.
don't, there's no class that teaches you how to learn. So you can go
No.
through and never get this stuff. So
Mm.
um, it can be really holding you back if you hadn't gotten that as a kid. And even, if you got some of that as a kid, it's nothing compared to taking it to the level of, what med school students are doing, what the top performing students in the world are doing, and then scaling it back a little
Mm.
bit, but applying that to yourself. So the second pillar is
Mm.
planning, and you know, something we might get into later in terms of kind of where I've
Mm-hmm.
gone since the
Mm-hmm.
medical school and lawyer and doctor stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the original universities, it was a trifecta. So it
Mm-hmm.
was you were studying medicine, you were studying law, or you studying
Mm-hmm.
theology.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the original trifecta. I've done some stuff in the theology
Mm-hmm.
department as well that is still kind of in development. So
Yep.
I'm not going to go into that, but one interesting angle on it is that psychology has a lot of elements that are very religious and functions
Mm-hmm.
in many ways like a religion for
Mm.
people. So
Mhm.
in the same way that like a priest might have a confessional with uh, somebody in their congregation, you
Mhm.
now go to BetterHelp and you get,
Sure.
you talk to somebody, and that
Mm.
pastoral stuff that the priest would be doing with you
Mhm.
has a lot of similarities to what that therapist is doing with you. So um,
Mm.
people tend to see that trifecta and think, oh, well, that theology thing is like completely different. But it's actually,
Mm.
if you think about what psychology
Mm.
does, um, another example of this is if you ever read some medical journal article and it's related to ethics, they'll
Mhm.
always reference the APA, the American Psychological Association, and the APA determines what the ethics are. So they're performing that theological
Mm.
function of determining
Mhm.
what is an ethical, whether it's brain implants or
Mm.
whatever else kind
Mhm.
of ethics of a certain experiment or whatever.
Mhm.
They
Mhm.
determine that. So that the second pillar, I know went off on a tangent. I took basically what I went from those three to then
Mhm.
saying, how do I even take this to a higher level? And I started
Sure.
looking at what do leaders and executives do. So I started in the business world because I was
Mhm.
looking for, in the same way I looked at, okay, what did doctors do in med school to learn? I wanted to
Mhm.
say, who's the best
Mhm.
planners? And so the best
Mhm.
planners are really big Fortune 500 companies and governments. Those are the only two
Mhm.
groups that do 50, 100-year planning. And I thought I was just
Sure.
going to Google and say, how do you create a 50-year plan? How do you create a 100-year plan? I thought there was going to be a bunch of stuff out there. And it turns
Mhm.
out there's pretty much nothing. So
Mhm.
um, I researched and got into that, and that took me to, okay, how do executives think about their productivity? How do they think about their long term
Mhm.
planning? And then how do
Mhm.
heads of state? So how does a president or a prime
Mhm.
minister or a other type of head of state,
Sure.
sovereign, think about planning? And
Yes.
so that's the second pillar. And then the third is
Mm.
organizing. So if you've
Mhm.
you've got a big library of books, if you've got files,
Mhm.
um, both business related files and like how do you organize all that stuff, whether it's in OneNote or Notion or Evernote,
Mhm.
um, or even just Google Docs or Microsoft Word,
Mhm.
all the different files and subfolders and that folder tree. How do you organize
Mhm.
that? And then also, which there's a fair amount of people that teach that kind of stuff, but then also, how do you organize all the physical stuff? So how do you organize your whole house or multiple
Mhm.
homes, um, vehicles, travel, uh,
Mhm.
each floor of each house, each room? Where does everything go? How do you keep track of it? How do you keep track of all, especially the expensive stuff that has a warranty or has insurance or
Mhm.
other stuff? How do you just keep
Mhm.
track of all the different, like there's literally thousands and thousands of things. And
Sure.
how do you keep track of all that? So that
Mm.
was the kind of third pillar. And there's a lot of other stuff, but those
Mhm.
three are kind of the key.
Mhm. What are some of the key differences in applying your productivity principles for professionals like doctors, lawyers, and managers?
So one of the interesting things is that within each of these fields, there's generally two, and you could include programmers and
Mhm.
software engineers in here as well, and other types of engineers. There's generally two tracks.
Mhm.
There's become a really, excuse me, in-depth expert
Mhm.
in your chosen field, or get into administration, get into management,
Mhm.
and climb that ladder. So, for example, one of my med school students, uh, she wanted to climb the ladder, and
Mhm.
she wasn't necessarily interested in. And there's even a third option, which is kind of starting your own practice. So it's with a legal
Mhm.
practice or medical practice or software engineering firm. So that's kind of a third path, which is quite entrepreneurial. So within each of these things, you kind of choose a path, and a lot of what you're doing depends on what that is. And you kind of, I'm not sure if I completely answered your question earlier about what is productivity or how I think about it,
Mhm.
but it's about inputs and outputs. So it's about how do you either there's kind of two things. Like I kind of lean more in the direction of I'm in the Boston area, and so uh, Henry Thoreau and Walden Pond is right next door, and his whole thing was I want to work. I think it was like 4 weeks out of the year or 8 weeks out of the year, and then live a very modest lifestyle, but do whatever I want to do. So that's one approach to productivity and that's kind of the 4-hour work week. How do I work a lot less and have that lifestyle of time freedom, but still make the kind of money that I want to make? And then the other thing is, well, if you want to work 50, 60, 80 hours a week, how do you do that, but get the most out of it? Because you can have two med students who are both studying for that same test, and one of them does a lot better, even though they spent the same amount of time, because one of them is using much more efficient, effective strategies. So it's about how do you get more out of the same resources, or how do you get the same output, but right now you're doing it with 60 hours a week. How do you cut that down to 20, 30 hours a week? And it's funny, when I talk, whether it's doctors or lawyers, but especially doctors and lawyers, and I think the reason why this happens is because it's kind of a traditional path that's known to be successful, especially the medical. It's getting tougher for lawyers, but it's something that it's going to be fairly successful going in if you just do the work. And so it's seductive in that way, because a lot of people get into it without really doing that long-term planning ahead of time and thinking, is this really what I want to do? And so they get into it, and then they get midway through their career and they realize, I have all this sunk cost. I don't really love doing this. I have enough money to kind of split my time 50-50, or, I want to do something else. And so they often will have major side projects or interesting hobbies that they're doing while being a doctor or being a lawyer. So that's another example of kind of getting more out of less. And,
yes.
Yeah.
How do things change for entrepreneurs, business owners, and leaders in business and government?
Yeah. So a key thing is like whether you're doing management or not. And I think a lot of people underestimate the time cost and the context switching cost of managing people. So, and another aspect of all of these things is that as you get into the higher levels, you're generally in management. It's always been difficult to measure the productivity of managers. It's also difficult to measure the productivity of very, very highly skilled specialists, because they're just doing things that are very difficult to measure. And oftentimes they're not doing enough things that you can do kind of apples to apples. So as you get better and better at what you do, you oftentimes don't know how good you are. And just in general, it's hard to measure how good is a lawyer, how good is a doctor. So, and there's interesting studies that show that sometimes experience with these professions doesn't necessarily have a strong correlation with being better at the job. So, and that's one of the interesting things with these standardized tests, is that they found that people that, like doctors, for example, that do better on the step 1 exam, they found that these doctors aren't necessarily better at being a doctor long term. So part of the problem is kind of reducing things to just a standardized test. But that's where I kind of made this shift into thinking more about getting in the flow and measuring the amount of time you spend in the flow. And the key things about the flow is that you have a balance between your skill level and the difficulty of the task. And then a third dimension that I add to it, which is how interested in it are you? How closely is there a motivational match? And if you can really zero in on all three, then you're going to do really, really well. And you're going to get into that flow experience where time disappears and you're really enjoying it. And so you can have somebody who's a bright person going through med school and the stuff isn't terribly difficult, but they're just not enjoying it. They don't have the motivation. And then it's going to be a slog. And at a certain point, you just get stressed out. You just can't do it. So a key thing with productivity is the motivation factor. And, you know, with business owners and with entrepreneurs, I came from a environment and a school where everybody went to college and it was very kind of academically focused. And so when I kind of went up in this alternative direction, I thought I was going to run into all these business owners and entrepreneurs who were like, had scored top SATs and done really well in school. And they kind of just transferred that and focused it on business instead of whatever their profession was.
Sure.
And the reality was actually quite different, where I found that a lot of these business people were not particularly intelligent. They generally didn't blow you away by being like a nerd or really smart or really erudite. So that made me really kind of question how I was looking at things, and showed me how important persistence and motivation is. And it sounds kind of trite. It sounds kind of like Tony Robbins, just motivational stuff, but it actually is true that if you take somebody who's highly motivated to do something and you put them against somebody who's, you know, significantly higher IQ, smarter, better learning strategies, that person who isn't quite as bright but is very determined is going to outperform that other person. So, and then there's another aspect of business and entrepreneurship, which is a fair amount of them. They like can't survive in a normal, you know, they don't like having a boss. They don't like waking up and being on a certain schedule. They just kind of can't function in that world. And what's interesting about it is that you would think, oh, well, that's kind of, that kind of person wouldn't be successful. But what it shows you actually is kind of like the burn your boats analogy. If somebody is really forced to be persistent because they can't be successful any other way and they can't give up, they can actually achieve a lot, even if they're not, you know, that top performing smartest student. And a lot of people think incorrectly that, well, if I didn't do that well in school, so this stuff doesn't apply to me, or this stuff isn't going to help me that much. And it's really not the case. A lot of it is just about not giving up, being persistent, doing it, putting in the hard yards, and just sticking to it. And
how does that, what can you tell us about how productivity works at the presidential and head of state level?
Yeah, so this is kind of, like I was saying before, once I finished those med school, law school projects, I wanted to take on the next challenge. And one of the interesting questions was, and this was around the Trump running for the presidency, one of the big questions was, you know, is Trump fit to be president? How smart is he? Is he going to be able to transfer his management skills from the Trump organization and all the business stuff? Does that transfer over to the presidency? I forget the guy's last name. It's John Dickerson. He's a journalist, author. I think he was on CNN, but he wrote a book called The Presidency, the Hardest Job in the World. So I was just thinking about all this medical school stuff, and I thought, oh, well, Navy SEALs Hell Week is 2 weeks. I think it's 2 weeks. But I started thinking about the med school 2 years up to the step 2 as hell years, because it really is. It's incredibly intense. And so I saw this book title of The Hardest Job in the World, and I thought, oh, maybe maybe there's something here. And I thought it was an interesting question of, how much does executive skill in business transfer over to the presidency? So I wanted to really figure out, what does a president do all day? How do they, they're making billion-dollar decisions every single day, trillion-dollar decisions. One of the first, the New Yorker leaked a memo from the Obama administration. Right when he came in, he had the financial crisis happening and had to make that, multi-trillion-dollar decision of what to do there. So I wanted to know, there's this whole system of memos and circulating things in the White House and the West Wing, and there's all these systems in place, and they call it a zero failure system. The presidency has to have a zero fail productivity system, basically, of planning things out, task management, basically, where you're setting assignments, assigning it to oftentimes multiple people, multiple advisors or aides. And so I wanted to understand at the highest level where there's the most money at stake. I'm putting together a presentation right now that's going to go into detail on RenTech, Renaissance Technologies, which is Jim Simon's hedge fund, which has been the highest performing hedge fund ever, and how he did that very early in AI and machine learning. So one of the kind of heuristics I like to use is who is spending the most money and or the most time or manpower on a problem. And then I like to look at model kind of how do they do that. So I wanted to see, what are the planning systems? What are the learning systems? What are the organization systems at the White House, in the Oval Office? And then, you can never take 100% of what's there and just translate it over, but what are the most interesting, unique things that are used in that environment? And then similar with the C-suite and executives, an interesting thing at the presidential level is there's this tradition where the chief of staff will hand over this, I think it's a mangled bicycle wheel. And it's a metaphor of the spokes of the wheel. So there was this big debate in the 50s and 60s and onward until about the 90s of how should the presidency and access to the president be organized. Should you have a set of 6 to 12 top aides who all have equal access to the president, kind of can come in and each talk to the president whenever they want? Or, which is more of the Democrat mode of management or style of management, as it's called today in management schools? Or should there be a more hierarchical system where you have the president, then you have the chief of staff, and then those aides all have to kind of report to the chief of staff? So Rahm Emanuel, for example, with Obama, he was that kind of, he was former mayor of Chicago, and he came in and he was like a very kind of hard charging, intense manager who could keep people in line. So there was a debate at the time, 50s, 60s, of the Republican style was you have a chief of staff, and this comes from a military thing where a general or a top level officer, higher level officer, will have a chief of staff who will take this, implement this process. So Eisenhower was a major systems builder, very organized, big player in World War II, obviously. And he took a lot of the systems that were in the military and brought them over and installed them in the White House. And so he was a Republican. And so there was this idea of, kind of a military feel to it. So people thought, oh, well, this is that's that Republican style, so we're not going to use that. So when JFK came in, for example, he went more to this flat organization thing where there wasn't a chief of staff. And it was basically chaos. And so over time, there was a back and forth and oscillation where you'd have a Republican president, they would have this chief of staff system. Then you have the Democrat president, they'd come in and get rid of it and not use it. And then sometimes kind of be forced to use it because it would just prove to be better. And then there was a consensus around the 80s and 90s that it just was better to have a strong chief of staff. Something, I think it's Richard Baker the third or Baker something, was under Reagan, and he was he's considered one of the best, if not the best, chiefs of staff. And he kind of mentored future chiefs of staff. So the interesting thing about the White House and the Oval Office is it's almost been this laboratory where the president comes in and they have a lot of leeway to basically organize the West Wing however they want and have whatever management style they want. And so over time, the things that have worked best have been kept from the previous administration to the next one. And when you really know something is becoming permanent is when something that one party implemented gets adopted by the other party and becomes a permanent thing. That's when it kind of becomes fully installed. And so it's an interesting window to look at management styles and management theory as to what really works in the crucible of the presidency and the Oval Office and what doesn't. And just as a final thing, we don't have to go into detail on it, but the presidency is kind of split in two, and this other side of it isn't talked about that much. So the chief of staff is really the chief of staff of the civilian aspect of the presidency. The national security advisor is the chief of staff of the military side of things. So there really are more like two chiefs of staff. The national security advisor really handles the more military stuff and the foreign policy. In some countries, it isn't set up like this in the presidency or the chief head of state, but in the United States, the foreign policy, all of that is given to the president. And so, and that's generally, a lot of that goes to the military, and especially nowadays, a lot less of it goes to the Department of State. So there's just a lot of, I just sort of got fascinated with that. And then, yeah, I've incorporated some of that stuff into my systems as well. So, and that links to more of my recent work. So the stuff that's on Udemy right now, the way to think about that is like in the earlier part of my career when I was kind of like, I was figuring stuff out for myself, I'd kind of put it together and just put it out there and see what people thought. It was almost like a polished rough draft. And I was really surprised how well this stuff did on Udemy, because I was not putting this wasn't the most highly polished, highest editing stuff. It was kind of like your YouTube channel, mine, where you don't really edit it together. There isn't a lot of cutting and special effects. I literally just record something, not edit it at all, and upload it. And these courses were getting 10,000 plus students. So that's kind of what's on Udemy. And now I've gone independent and sell stuff through my website, and basically if you're on, and basically through my newsletter. So a lot of the stuff that I teach now isn't even on my website. You basically just sign up to my free newsletter, and then you know, I send out an email or two a month, and then every few months I might announce that I'm doing some course. So if people want to just go to timothykenny.com, KENNY, you can just sign up on my homepage to the newsletter, and then you'll get, you know, whatever updates on that kind of stuff.
What are some of the mistakes you see among wealthier people in their approach to their learning, planning, and overall productivity?
One of the biggest ones, and especially, so there's kind of two ways of thinking about this. There's the kind of classical wealth management where you're thinking about both philanthropy, but also passing things on to the next generation and potentially generation skipping kind of things. And so there's a lot of focus on that. And sometimes you'll have a consultant, you know, college consultant who will help your kids get into a college. You might hire an SAT tutor. There's a whole thing I have a course that was originally a bonus called Think Like a POTUS. And there's a bonus module there that's basically JFK's father. He was extremely, he wanted to be president himself. He helped FDR a lot.
That's Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph Kennedy.
Who had problems with his stock market manipulation.
Yeah, there's a really funny story there, actually, because he was Irish and all the banks in Boston at the time were controlled by Protestants, and he was Irish Catholic. So he couldn't get a bank job. He went to Harvard, and at the time, Harvard was pure elective, so you didn't have to have a major. You just took whatever you wanted, buffet style. So
Mhm.
he goes and he wants to get in. He can't get a job at a bank, so he becomes a bank inspector for the state. He takes a
Mhm.
standardized test, gets that, um, and starts inspecting all of these banks and learns the trade through doing that. Then he gets a bunch of money together from other Irish Catholic people in Boston. They start a very small bank, and then he got into banking through that. He made a lot of money in banking and investing, like you said. And it was kind of like the wild west of crypto is today, where a
Mhm.
lot of the stuff that is now illegal wasn't illegal at the time. So
Mm.
all kinds of manipulation and stuff, it wasn't illegal. It was just,
No.
it was the wild west. So
Well, yeah, exactly.
he's the equivalent of one of these guys who made a ton of money in crypto. Then what he did is he went into Hollywood and created a Hollywood studio, and made a lot of money in Hollywood. And then he got involved with helping FDR run for the presidency or get reelected or something. And so he got an ambassadorship to the UK as a reward, and he used that to send his two eldest sons to the different embassies and give them a priceless education through that. He also paid for tutors in every single subject that his sons were going through at Harvard. They both got into Harvard as well. Wasn't as hard back in the day to get into Harvard. It was more like a 20, 30, 40% acceptance rate. So
Mhm.
whereas today it's like 5%. But he
Mhm.
had, he just pulled out all the stops to help his sons. And then he actually became he was briefly the head of the Merchant Marine or something, which was international trade. And then he was the first head of the SEC. So FDR created the SEC,
Mhm.
Securities Exchange Commission,
Mm.
and he took all the knowledge he had of exploiting and
Mhm.
manipulating the markets
Mhm.
and did a really good job creating a bunch of regulations to stop that from ever happening again.
Mm.
He also predicted the Great Depression crash of 1929. And so he made a lot of money on the way up, and he shorted the market and made a ton of money on the way down.
Mhm.
So he was a really interesting character. And he got into a conflict with FDR, and they decided, he basically wasn't going to be able to run for president because he was what was it called? It wasn't pacifist, but in World War II or World War One, it
Mhm.
was uh, there was a name for people that didn't want to go to war,
Mhm.
and so
Conscientious objector? No?
it was the
Uh,
foreign. It was the name for the foreign policy of
okay.
staying out of the war or not
Okay.
getting involved.
Yep.
So things ended up going the other way, and because of that, he was never going to be able to run for president. And so
Mhm.
then he focused all his energy on getting his eldest son, Joseph B. Kennedy Jr., to
Mhm.
run for president. And then what happened is, so they both, he was in the Air Force, and then JFK was in the Navy, and
Mhm.
JFK became a war hero with the whole PT boat thing.
Yes.
And so he comes back a war hero, and now his older brother is thinking, hey, I need a story. If I'm going to run for president, I can't have a younger brother who's achieved a lot more than I have. So it's right about the end of the war. He signs up for this really, really dangerous mission where they're going to fly a plane full of explosives using a very rudimentary kind of drone warfare, where they were going to angle the plane to hit some, I think, German installation, and and then jump parachute out. And
Mm.
there's different theories of what caused it to explode midair before they were able to jump out. But basically,
Mhm.
he was instantly killed in an explosion. And then the mantle fell to JFK to basically take on running for the
Mhm.
presidency. And then the rest is history.
Mm. Mhm. What do you see as the differences in how younger versus older people approach their learning?
Actually, I want to come back to that, but I didn't fully answer your
Mhm.
question, which is
Mhm.
wealthy people. I think they invest these things in the standard model of going through higher education, but more and more you need these entrepreneurial skills, and it's getting extremely competitive to just go along these traditional paths. And these colleges don't have the incentives to really look at where the opportunities, for people once they graduate and giving them the right skills. So I think it's extremely important that you figure out at a very early age what are you interested in and try out different things. And then whether you get a degree or not, figure out the right path and really think 10, 20, 30, really think through the entire career. You have to have a plan for your entire career until you retire and beyond of what is life like when you go down this path, and what are my interests, what are my strategic advantages. That's another thing I think about and kind of I took from both how big companies and governments think in terms of their long-term planning is they think about what are our strategic advantages and disadvantages and how do we play those cards. And a lot of people don't think about that when they're planning out their career, and going to college is just the first step in that. So people aren't doing that planning, and parents aren't helping their kids do that planning. And there's all this stuff in the US now about forgiving these mountains of college debt. And a lot of that has to do with people not really thinking, I would say it's very rare that somebody that can't pay back their debt had a really solid 50, 100-year plan for their career and had done all this stuff, all this thinking before they signed that loan document. So I think that kind of stuff is really important, but also if there's a family business or if you're particularly skilled in a field or with management or with just kind of skills that transcend a certain profession, I think it's extremely important to pass that down to your children and have a plan for doing that. So, and have mentors as well. A mentor is almost kind of a parental figure who helps you throughout your career face different challenges. And a good thought experiment that I give to people is think about these families where everybody in the family is a doctor or a lawyer, or think about some of these families where everybody's a doctor. Think about at each stage of life that a kid in that family has, where they can talk to mom and dad and ask them, oh, what am I supposed to do here? What comes next after here? And the parent says, oh, well, you don't want to do that because 20 years down the road, you're going to run into this brick wall or you're going to hit this ceiling. And so you don't go down that bad road. You don't make that mistake, go into that cul-de-sac. So you start with that end in mind. And similar with, JPK. So he had this whole plan for how he was going to run for president. And then he passed that down to his two eldest sons. So it's a similar kind of thing of thinking backwards from the result and the end in mind. If it's a family of doctors or family of lawyers or family of politicians, what's the level of knowledge that they're passing, that the best of those kind of families are passing down to the next generation? And then if you don't have that knowledge and experience to pass down, how do you as the parent or even the grandparent or aunt or uncle, how do you find somebody who can play that role to pass that knowledge down? And if you're the kid or the student, or you're the person who needs that kind of mentorship or help, that should be your goal of what you're trying to achieve. Of I need to surround myself with the type of knowledgeable people and expertise, and maybe there's books and courses as well that can fill in the gaps. But how do I surround myself with that kind of talent, those kind of, and think about the presidential level, how they're surrounded by advisors who can advise them in different categories, and they can pick up the phone and talk to a professor at Harvard if they need to. So how do you get as close as possible to replicating that kind of situation? You look at Elon Musk as well with his Ad Astra school. So he created his own school, and a bunch of other employees at Tesla and SpaceX and their kids there. So you think about, what is the ultimate educational experience that I could give? And then to the extent that I can't do that myself, or my spouse can't do that, or other people in the family can't do that, how do we bring in the right people to get that happening and start
Mhm.
it at an early age. So Mark Zuckerberg and his wife have taught their kids Chinese. Jared Kushner and Ivanka had their kids learning Chinese Mandarin from a very early age. So these are some examples of kind of what people who have a lot of resources do, and then to what extent can you set up similar things for your kids and your family to really give them the best. And when you think that way, whatever's happening in the school or whatever's happening in college is kind of completely irrelevant, because you're going back to thinking about first principles. And if, what's the ultimate best way to do this, and then work your way backwards. And if college fits into that, or some other thing fits into that, that's great. If it doesn't, then just don't do it. Instead of, just going down these traditional paths without really asking deeper questions.
What do you think's some of the biggest mistakes you see people making in their productivity systems?
I think for a lot of people, they don't have a system, but another thing is making something that's too complex. You have to, the most important, like, if you look at a lot of people who are very prodigious, that just have a prodigious output. I was looking at your channels. I think you've got probably 5 to 10,000 videos total over the last 10 years across your channels. There's certain people who just put out orders of magnitude more stuff. These academics who have put out hundreds of papers and written dozens of books. I've looked at a lot of those types of people, and what you realize is they tend to not have incredibly complex systems, and there were very prodigious people before computers. So there wasn't even the ability to create some of these complex database type systems, even if you wanted to, or it's very rudimentary. So the big thing I've learned, and that goes back to what I said earlier about motivation. I really early in my career, I wanted to figure out, because there was a lot of pressure on me to take the traditional path because I had done well in school. And so it was kind of a predictable thing. And my parents, wanted me to take the lawyer, doctor, surgeon type path. And I had the grades and everything to do that, but that wasn't where my motivation was. And I wanted to kind of see what else was out there. But also, it's so difficult kind of jumping into the deep end when you don't really understand or have a causal theoretical model of, well, why are certain people successful and other people not? And that's kind of stuff that Tony Robbins talks about in various personal development things. And a big thing that I got from Tony is modeling. So instead of, a textbook can go out of date. A textbook can be separated from reality, but and this was big with the Harvard Business School. They switched from lecture mode to the case method, and that case method actually came from the law school. The law schools in the late 1800s were all teaching via the lecture method, and then Harvard decided to go to case method, I think under President Eliot, and that changed I actually have a series on Obama's education that's going to be coming out on my channel pretty soon. And he went to Harvard Law School. Michelle Obama went to Harvard Law School. I did a video about a month ago on Ben Shapiro, went to Harvard Law School. So the case method came from law and then went into Harvard Business School. So after Harvard did it in their law school, all the other law schools slavishly copied Harvard, which is basically how things happen in general. Is Harvard does something, then everybody else copies it. Harvard did that with their business school. All the other business schools copied it. And so the case-based method is a type of this role modeling method. The difference is I like to look at a person or a company and look at what do they do over time. So I actually have this is one of my more popular courses on Udemy. It's called a modeling report. and it's on Elon Musk. So it's kind of like a biography, and I've never seen somebody really do this. So I don't know. I doubt I'm the one who invented this genre, but it's basically a genre of biography where it's actionable. So it's, instead of saying, well, just what did this person do and telling a bunch of stories, it's what are the actionable strategies? What are the generalizations you can make looking at this person's life? How did they approach problem solving? And then how do you make that actionable and apply that in your own life? And similar thing with a company. What are the things that a company, strategies that a company uses that you can incorporate into your own life? So I did that with Elon Musk and put out that course. And I have a bunch of videos on my channel as well on Elon. Like, he read the encyclopedia at a young age, and I have a whole thing on encyclopedias. So I really focus, I like to go kind of 50-50. So 50% of my effort goes into looking at people who have been successful in whatever I do and trying to pull out the strategies there, because that keeps me connected with reality. That keeps me from, oh, this is what my theory is. This is what I read in the textbook. So I'm just going to stick to that no matter what happens. The other thing, though, is that if you don't have the theoretical backbone, then you can see something happening out in the wild and it's not going to make any sense to you. But even worse than that, you actually won't see certain things. If you don't, it's part of just perception theory. But if you don't have certain frameworks, you're not going to, certain things will just be invisible to you. You won't even notice it. You won't know what to look for. So you really need to marry the two and have strength in both areas. So, that was something I did early in my career, where I looked at who's successful at this kind of stuff, what do they do? And then I also looked at what's the theoretical component, what do the textbooks say, and then have the best of both worlds, and then know how to approach each situation. So that's a key thing as well, where, and you look back at the JPK story, for example, he's sending his sons to these embassies and they're learning through experience. An interesting story with Mark Zuckerberg is his parents gave him the option, go to Harvard, or we're going to put you in charge of a McDonald's franchise at 18 years old. So he was going to, learn how to manage a business at an early age by just taking over a kind of, it's almost the equivalent of being a kid and like running a ice cream stand or a popcorn stand at the baseball stadium. It's a kind of toy business that you learn the ropes on. And so it just shows you, it's a
McDonald's is famous for many systems, of course, as well there.
Do you know anything about the systems, or?
I know a bit there. They have systems for many of the tasks there, so that no one employee is central to the success or failure of the store.
Yeah, and I think the military is very similar in the sense that there's standard operating procedures and everybody does things the same way, and it's kind of drilled into memory. And this was a big thing with George Washington. I forget this guy's name, but he brought this, I think, Prussian general in the later stages of the Revolutionary War to train the soldiers, because they were just these random farmers who they picked up from all sorts of places, and they didn't have any drills. So this guy created the initial drill and procedures manual, got all these guys drilled, and then that got spread throughout the Continental Army and led to the victory in Yorktown and, the overall success of the revolution. So, and then Napoleon was similar with him, being very focused on, Napoleon was all about, how can I take a mass of uneducated, uncivilized almost group of hundreds of thousands of men, and how can I shape them in a short period of time into a functional army that I can then lead into battle? And he was able to do that. He was one of the best at that. So when you look at that, it's kind of it's a different way of thinking about productivity, but the general in a military is also thinking about, on the chessboard of that battle, how do I get more results out of my soldiers than the other general gets out of his soldiers? So, um, yeah, I think McDonald's does a great job at that, and you get a very consistent product wherever you go. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
What do you think some of the biggest misconceptions people have when thinking about their approach to lifelong learning?
yeah, I think it's that long-term perspective, and it's I think what a really good parent does and a really good education system does is it's thinking decades ahead. And there's committees and boards that get together of people who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who are the elder leaders in various fields. And what they do is they're part of various nonprofits or standardization or accreditation uh, groups or major universities or conglomerations of universities that set standards, or they're working in the Department of Education, stuff like that, where they're basically deciding how much funding should we put into different paths. Should we create a new professor of this or that? Where are the growth areas? Where do we need more people? Part of the early days, with all these layoffs at the big tech companies, part of what's changed is that in early Silicon Valley, there weren't a lot of computer engineers, programmers, electrical engineers. There just was a real lack of talent. And we've now somewhat caught up to that talent. But it just shows you if the pipeline isn't there, then 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. I was just reading Michelle Obama's autobiography, or one of them. And when both Obamas were at Harvard Law School, the big thing was that there was like only 3 black law professors and there were no female black law professors. So there was a lot of Derek Bell was involved in this. One of the earliest videos out there of Obama ever speaking publicly anywhere. I think it actually is the first. It's like a short 20, 30-second PBS clip. It's Obama introducing Derek Bell, who was big into the whole, I think, founding father or close to a founding father of critical legal studies.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of in its early days at Harvard Law School. So there was this speech Obama was giving was about Derek Bell basically ended up resigning from Harvard Law because, as a protest, because they weren't hiring the first black female law professor. But part of the problem with these pipeline things is, well, if there aren't enough black women interested in going to law school when their parents aren't pushing them down that path, or there aren't support systems decades earlier, there aren't necessarily going to be enough people down the line. So these kind of pipeline problems, you want to look at where is the supply, where is the demand, and then be going into a place that's advantageous. And a lot of these people that took out loans, the problem was they weren't thinking about that. They thought they were kind of immune from the market. And what we're learning now is you're not going to work at the same company for 50 years. I mean, all this stuff is almost passe to a lot of people that are probably watching, but the ultimate thing I say is you have to get out of this employee mindset and basically stop even using that language and really reframe it to you're a contractor, you're a one person business. And if you're an employee, that means you have one client. That means your entire business is dependent on one client. And there's a huge amount of risk, obviously, if you're a company and you're reliant on one client. But that's the kind of, and there's a supply and demand, and that's what the job market is. And there's some protections in place, but ultimately that's the situation. And so you have to be thinking from an early age, what am I going to do? And even a lot of doctors, even a lot of lawyers, when they graduate or they pass their bar exam, they're not sure what they're going to do next. They're not sure what specialty they're going to get into. So, and even if you're in the middle of your career, a lot of people switch directions mid-career or decide to do something else. Um, One of the things Obama talked about with his experience at Harvard Law School is that a big thing that gave him an advantage, and he was the first Black president of the Harvard Law Review, which is like the most prestigious thing you can do when you're at Harvard
Mhm.
Law, is be on that law review, and be the president of it. So he said a big advantage for him was he took a 3-year period after graduating from Columbia and went and did community organizing in Chicago, then applied to Harvard Law, and Northwestern also wanted him. They basically were begging him to go to Northwestern Law, and he decided to go to Harvard instead. But he said he was like 3 years older, 3 years wiser than a lot of the other students who had gone straight through from college to Harvard Law. That's what Michelle did. So what happened with Michelle, the way they met is Michelle was his mentor at a summer internship at this law firm in Chicago. And
Mhm.
she was 25, he was 27. So she was more senior than him, but he was
Mhm.
actually older than her. And
Mhm.
after she was at this law firm for a few years, she realized she didn't want to be a lawyer, and she left and did some other stuff, ended up in an executive position at the University of Chicago hospital system.
Mhm.
Um, but she had never really thought strategically about, like, do I really want to do this? It was just checking off. And she talks about this in her memoir. This isn't my color on it. It's, she says she was just checking the boxes, going from thing to thing, having the plan,
Mhm.
and it ended up kind of blowing up. And then she switched things and found something she liked doing. But that was big. So you have to make sure you're not kind of in tunnel vision. Same thing with Elon Musk. He was going to go to Stanford um, to get his PhD in battery science. And then he realized,
Mhm.
hey, there's this big entrepreneurship thing. He created Zip2. That's how he got his seed money. His first, I think
Mhm.
it was 20 million or 200 million from Zip2,
Mhm.
which was like Google Maps before Google Maps,
Mhm.
directory system. So that's how he got his money to get into Tesla and get into the PayPal
Mhm.
actually, and then into Tesla. I
That's
think
right.
he
Yep.
made 20 mil in Zip2, brought that over
Mhm.
to PayPal. He was X.com. He's going to now take all that stuff at PayPal X.com, roll it into
Mhm.
PayPal, and PayPal's Twitter. So Twitter is basically, I think, going to become a sort of PayPal clone or PayPal 2.0.
Mm.
But he took that 200 mil he made from PayPal and then rolled that into Tesla and SpaceX and Solar City and Boring Company and other
Mm.
things. Um, so he saw, he was on that path, but he also was keeping his eyes very wide open to what are my other
Mhm.
options, what's going else on elsewhere in the world, and not having that tunnel vision. So um, but then it's also, the spaced repetition. So
Mhm.
the the larger framework that I expanded beyond those 3 pillars of speed reading, note taking, and memory is, it really starts with, you have a system for organizing your learning portfolio. That's your learning project
Mhm.
organization system. Everything you're learning, just like you take courses in college or university or high school, and sometimes they're project based. There's one big project, or you're getting a master's or a doctorate and you're going to do your thesis, your dissertation. You're kind of setting, in my system, you create a project with key deliverables, key outcomes you want to get. And then all your learning is directed towards that outcome. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to learn a bunch of stuff, read a bunch of books, and then hopefully I'll have what I need. It's, what are my deliverables? Create your project. I have a 1 page, we were talking about this before we started. I'm going to give away a my learning project organization system. So it's a course. Sorry, my 1 pager project management template. So if you just email support@timothykenny.com and put Archie in the subject line, I'll have somebody get back to you with this free stuff. Um, but you'll get that template and the course that goes along with it, and my learning system, which is called Endgame. It's like a 30 hours of video. We'll send that to you. But basically, it's you have that system for organizing your portfolio where each project is kind of like a stock, and you're investing a certain amount in each of these projects. You're divvying up your time into the various projects. and there's clear outcomes of like what you want to achieve. Like I need a checklist for how do I install a WordPress website. And this is a good thing to bring up, because with the lifelong learning, if you're learning to install a WordPress website, you're going to do it once and then maybe maintain it, maybe pass it on to somebody else, but you don't need to memorize that process. You just need to have a Notion or Obsidian or Evernote or OneNote or Microsoft Word or Google Docs. Have a system with folders and subfolders where you can find that checklist 2 years from now, 5 years from now, of how do I install a WordPress website, but you don't need to memorize that. So you don't want to memorize stuff you don't have to memorize. That's kind of your second brain, Tiago Forte. I've got 3 different interviews with Tiago that you can check out. 2 of them, I interviewed him. One of them, he interviewed me. And I have a 3-hour interview with Scott H. Young that people can also check out on my channel. But basically, your second brain is how do you keep as much as possible outside your brain? Because it's very expensive to memorize stuff. So if you need to memorize it, like business principles, you really need to have that locked and loaded. But there's a lot of stuff where it's a checklist or some process or some reference material. The thing is, a year or 2 later, you'll forget you even read that. You'll forget you even used to know that at one time. You'll forget what all those little factoids are. So you need to have a system where you can go in months, years later and know where to find that information. So okay, this is the folder where I keep all the technology stuff. And then within that, there's the website stuff. And within that, there's the WordPress stuff. So you need to have a whole framework for that. And that's something that's in my courses. And that allows you to kind of go through the library of all your content and have it all organized in a Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress classification type system. So that's how you find stuff that you've stored away in the computer, in your file cabinets and stuff like that. And that's one type of outcome for a learning project. Another type is you're gonna actually memorize it and keep it long-term. And that's where you get into space memorization, space repetition, flashcards, Anki, stuff like that. So you start out with that learning project organization system, that big framework. Then you get into skill investing, where you're thinking about how do I invest in the right skills, the right knowledge, so that it's going to get me to my 10, 20, 50-year goals, or even, 3 to 5 year goals, quarterly, monthly goals. But you're always thinking about in terms of I'm investing time and I'm investing money. And how do I have enough time and money to achieve all these things so you don't overload yourself? But also, how do you split it up in a way that makes sense? Don't invest a tiny amount in the most important things and invest a huge amount in stuff that doesn't matter. So that's skill investing. Only then do you get into the next stage, which is research. And this is where you think like a chef, you think like Gordon Ramsay. You need the best ingredients. If you have, I don't know if you ever watched this show, I think it was called Chopped, but it was like they take fast food and like stuff at a convenience store and you have to turn it into like a gourmet meal, and they take chefs and 3 of them compete. So you don't want to make the mistake of, reading New York Times bestsellers, reading a bunch of SEO optimized stuff. And then just like, that's the equivalent of going to the convenience store, going to the gas station store, going to, maybe the low end local supermarket and picking stuff up. Whereas if you're really good at research, you go to the farmer's market, or you're getting stuff from the best farmer in the area and it's delivered to you, or it's like the finest meats flown in from, Wagyu beef. You're getting flown in the best ingredients. So before you even get into stuff like speed reading, it's like, do you want to be really good at like chopping up tiny pieces of like garbage materials, garbage ingredients, or do you want to take your time but work with only the best ingredients? So that's research, and you want to get really, really good at that. Only then do you get to stuff like speed reading. The secret with speed reading is that when you're in productivity, you're always thinking about bottlenecks. Where's the bottleneck here? Like if you're pumping out Tesla cars and you're missing one, with COVID and the supply chain issues, you're missing one part, you can't ship. There's computer chip shortage. You couldn't ship a lot of Ford had a lot of problems with their trucks. There's just a lot of things they couldn't get out because there weren't enough chips. So you want to look at bottlenecks, and people think pace of reading is the problem, but it's really, again, thinking from the end in mind. The goal is to get the information out of the book. Let's say WordPress for Dummies, get it out of the book and either into your brain if you need to memorize it, like a med school student, or you need to get it into your Evernote, let's say, get it into a checklist, and then be able to find it later on. So that's the task. How fast you're reading may or may not apply to that. Like if you can go research and find somebody who already created a list instead of reading WordPress for Dummies, you could save 10 hours just there. If you can pay somebody $100 to put that together for you and save 10 hours of time by, being surrounded by high quality advisors, high quality experts, that's going to save you a huge amount of time. So when you get overly focused on, I'm just going to read faster, you're missing the forest for the trees. So here's the other thing. The process of getting from a book or from a website article or from a video course or from a YouTube video to your deliverable, that's the goal. Whether you're reading it or somebody else is doing it, you need to really zoom out and think about the goal and not be in this school mindset of, I just kind of robotically do what the teacher tells me to do in the same way every time because that's how I'm going to get graded. It everything needs to be results oriented. So if you need to create that checklist, you may need to go through that book and mark down, okay, this page, this page, this page, this is where all the good stuff is. You have to be able to skim the stuff that doesn't matter, but when you find stuff that does matter, you should read it very slowly. You should take notes in the margins. You should highlight. You should maybe, take a screenshot of something or copy and paste text into your OneNote or into your Evernote. And you should go very slow and deliberate. Because here's the thing, here's the thought experiment with speed reading. If you speed read and you retain 20% or even 50% or even 80%, and that's obviously decaying over time, then you're either going to miss steps and you're going to mess things up. Like sometimes you need the important stuff that you need to retain 100% of it, or you need to at least extract it and get it into your own system. I think of it as panning for gold, or you've got the square screen and you're screening out all the dirt and trying to get the golden nuggets. So that's what you need to do, and you don't want to be letting golden nuggets trickle through because your screen is too big because you're trying to read too fast and going all over the place. So what's usually the most efficient way to learn is actually to be taking very detailed annotations of what you're reading and go slow enough that you can do those annotations, annotate everything, and then go back a second time and extract all that stuff, put it into your system, or create flashcards so you can memorize, or just create notes that you can review over time. And then you're done with it. But when you're you think about speed reading, and it's like, well, how are you going to retain that stuff? So from my initial system of these 3 pillars, I was thinking, if I speed read stuff but I don't retain anything, then it's like putting money in your pockets and there's big holes in your pockets and it's just flowing straight through. It's like you're running a company with lots of revenue and huge expenses. You're not actually making any profit. So don't focus on, these people that are like, I read 100 books this year. I read 1,000 books this year. What did you retain from that? Because it's like you have 100,000 in revenue and your expenses are 100,000 or 95,000. So
gotcha. Yes.
Tell
me this. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that with these recent new phenomena like the quiet quitting and the remote work in terms of how they relate to productivity? Big changes with the COVID situation and how we were working.
So one of the big strategic things you think about, and sometimes this is kind of an interesting surprise, that whether you're a dentist or you're a surgeon or a GP or a radiologist or a lawyer of various specialties, you realize once you get out of school that you actually do have to think entrepreneurially. Either you're an entrepreneur within a department, but eventually you're going to,
Mm-hmm.
if you rise up the ranks, you're going to have to be looking at budgets. You're going to be looking at how to grow things, or at least how to not reduce things, and keep things going. So you need to have those management skills. You need to have those entrepreneurial skills. And one of the things that kind of encouraged me to not take that more traditional path is that when you're working in a company, your income is capped, and you're generally gonna have to climb certain rungs, and there's a certain amount more you can make as you climb the rungs, but it's usually you have to wait a year or two here, year or two there. And if you're significantly more productive than other people, you're generally not going to get rewarded for that, because you're within a system that kind of keeps your income uh, from growing too fast, too quickly. And same thing in the nonprofit world. If you're measuring not income but impact, you're going to have to go through some system that's going to keep you from having too big of an impact until you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
slow you down. So once you get the idea of, I do want to be, some people say, hey, I'm already more productive. A lot of people that are into productivity, they're actually already above average productivity. And it's kind of like their secret weapon. It's kind of the thing that they're good at. And so they're like, let me really get even better at this and really double down on this because it's already been working for me. So let me take it to the next level. And so I think with people that are quiet quitting, for example, part of what they don't like is that they don't have a lot of power, or they at least don't feel like they have a lot of power in the negotiation. So there's a lot of inflation happening. You don't feel like you're being rewarded. You don't know how to negotiate. You don't even know how companies really think about, your value as an employee, and you don't have an alternative option where you can kind of go independent. So, uh, I think it's a symptom of the larger issue of people are being sold, whether they're going to law school. I mean, Obama said this in one of his memoirs. He said, law school is just a very intricate form of accounting. And what he's getting at there is like you're learning a lot of rules and intricacies. And his whole thing is he didn't want to make a lot of money. He wanted to have a lot of impact. And so he got all these offers to work at big law firms and stuff like that, but he wanted to get into politics. He was already thinking about running for president. And so he wanted to have a big impact. And so his productivity was oriented around, how do I do what matters? When he was president of Harvard Law Review, he had this equanimity and kind of ability to take both sides of an issue. Same thing when he was teaching law at University of Chicago. People said, you couldn't tell what his position was, Democrat or Republican, based on how he taught. He put it right down the middle, was able to argue both sides of issues. And if his class was leaning one way, he would play devil's advocate or advocate or kind of explain the other side of the issue, challenge his students. And he was similar at Harvard Law Review, where he really gave both sides the ability to speak their mind and kind of tried to be balanced like that. And a lot of people didn't like that he was like that, and kind of try to pressure him out of that. And his whole attitude was, most people don't even read this stuff. He didn't put a lot of time. He had to put a fair amount of time into his editorship, or presidency at Harvard Law Review, but he also knew, like, I don't really care that much about how well this does, so I'll put enough time into it, but I'm not going to go way overboard because there's other stuff that matters more. So, and he also set a goal for himself. He wanted to graduate magna cum laude, and he did that. And so if you don't have that understanding of how to negotiate, and you also don't have that big picture plan, then you get caught in these traps where you have a sunk cost, where you've spent 4 years in school or 6 years in school and time before that in high school working for this very ambiguous goal where you didn't know ahead of time. You didn't go on Glassdoor and figure out, okay, how much does this kind of professional make? How much does this person make? How long does it take to get to the next level? How do they determine who gets to the next level? What are my competitive advantages going to be? And the thing is, whether you're a business or whether you're an employee or what I call business of one, you're not really going to be able to avoid competition from other people, both people in other countries who are going to work. Elon's talked about how he sees his Chinese employees of Tesla being harder working than Americans. I think a lot of people, there's an old saying of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And it's actually kind of a wealth management thing of a lot of families when they're dealing with large inheritances, they find that it's very difficult to get the future generations to be as hardworking as the one that created the business and created the massive wealth at the beginning. And so, and part of that problem is you're passing down money, but you're not passing down strategy and you're not passing down knowledge and wisdom. And so, that's a really key thing to be able to pass down the learning and the planning and the strategy of thinking 10, 20, 50 years ahead. And when you look at Obama, for example, he knew he wanted to run for president at a very early age. There's reports that it was as early as 4th and 5th grade. He wrote an essay in elementary school that he was going to be president. There was intimations of it in early college. So he had this plan of decades ahead, and everything he was doing was based on, okay, how does that fit into my multi-decade plan? And if it doesn't fit in, Bill Clinton was similar in how he was planning things out. Did the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, Rhodes Scholar, quit. I think it was a 3-year program, and he quit in the 2nd year because he wanted to get into politics. So, people who have these long-term plans, and when you read their autobiographies, you see that a key part of their success is that they were thinking decades ahead, and they had done the research to figure out, okay, what is the strategy at each stage to get to this next step? And so quiet quitting is a symptom of such a larger issue of, and I think of the system getting worse and worse, where there's less and less of a correlation of you're going to school, you're going to college, you're getting your degree, and it's just less and less value each year because you're pumping out more of them. It's like if you're pumping out more and more Rolexes and you're not keeping the supply low, then the price is just going to go down. The value is going to go down. Same way you have all these schools pumping out degrees, and it's just, and you have labor from other countries. And a lot of these big companies, they're like, why are we hiring an American when we can hire somebody in India or the Philippines or somewhere else where it's a half or a third or a fifth of the price? And a lot of Americans kind of have blinders on where they don't realize you're now competing with people all across the world. And that's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to realize you need to kind of be, if you're competing with somebody who makes 20% of what you do and does the same job, you really need to be 5 times as good as them, or somehow rationalize to a company paying you 5x more to do the same work. And if you're going to college, that means you're doing information work, generally speaking. So there's no reason somebody in another country can't do your information work at a fraction of the cost. So one thing you can do is you can hire people, and you can get some of that by hiring those kind of people. And that's part of what 4-Hour Workweek teaches. Or you can move to a country where it's cheaper to live and lower your living expenses. But the party is kind of over of this post-World War II living high off the hog. And a lot of people were kind of raised by parents where it's like, do whatever you feel like doing, follow your passion. Not, there's a massive amount of competition, and a lot of these people are a lot harder worker than you, and they're not as lazy as you, and they have lower living expenses. So people are only starting to wake up and realize, like, you got hoodwinked in multiple ways, and the elders of the system, the politicians, the people at the nonprofits, they really have not been doing their job as the older generation to really restructure things. Because it's kind of like you can blame young people to a certain extent. I kind of figured this stuff out at a young age because I kind of got lucky and read, the 4 Hour Work Week, and that led me to other things to kind of question a lot of these
Mhm.
things. But maybe half of the blame is on the person who writes, signs that loan agreement and signs their life away. But it's also the responsibility of the older generations to be doing this long-term planning and making the tough
Mhm.
decisions. And for whatever reason, it
Mhm.
didn't happen. And we're now kind of, it's now all blowing up, and we're seeing a lot of casualties.
Tell me this: you've published dozens of courses. How do all of them fit together?
So I kind of hinted at this earlier in a couple ways. There's, it's productivity, which is just looking at how can you get better efficiency out of what you do? How do you waste less time? And ideally, people don't think of motivation as a strategic advantage, but that's part of the thing when you look at like the immigrant mindset, for example, like JFK's ancestors when they came to Boston and they were working, JFK's ancestor from Ireland, basically the eldest son inherited the farm, and then all the younger sons had to go out and take on a trade. And so the younger son that JFK traces back to was a cooper who makes barrels. And he came over the US, worked in Cooper, basically worked himself to death at like 35 or 40. He died, left one son. That son was then, I think, JPK's father. And that kind of immigrant work ethic tends to peter off over the generations. And part of the struggle for parents is to how do you inculcate that work ethic and that ethos and not kind of create spoiled children that so part of the stuff, people have it usually half right, half wrong. Some of the problems with the millennials, Gen Z, is that they were children of the baby boomers, and this is a predictable thing that happens where parents will spoil their children, not inculcate the right work ethic, kind of keep them insulated from globalization and all this competition, and then it blows up later. But it's also uh, actually I forget what the other half of that was, but um, it's about wasting less time, but also the competitive advantage and motivation. And so a lot of the success comes down to just being motivated. That's where finding your passion helps. But it's also if you're just too comfortable, you're not going to have motivation. So intentionally kind of not being too comfortable. Elon, for example, set a challenge for himself when he originally came from South Africa to Canada,
Yes.
worked around in Canada, traveled around Canada, set himself a challenge to live on $1 a day, and kind of intentionally put himself in a more difficult situation. So, and wanted to challenge himself. Same thing with the Tiger Woods story I told earlier about. He wanted to find, Michael Jordan, same thing, wanted to see if he could play baseball. So wanting to kind of challenge himself and not get too comfortable, I think is big. But the unifying thing is looking at different areas of my life, kind of starting from first principles. What's the best way to do this? I take a combination of a theoretical approach and read a lot of academic stuff. I'd say 90% of my reading is academic books. And so that's where I get the theoretical component and really break it all the way down to the studs and the foundation of, okay, what's really real here? What's the theoretical underpinning here? For example, the Rentec story, Jim Simons, none of these guys were from finance. They were all mathematicians. And Jim had the innovation that, we can basically be quantitative traders. And he invented quantitative. He was one of the first and the first to really kind of legitimate it. kind of as a form of very high-end technical analysis via machine learning and AI. And they just cracked the code on that very early on and found the algorithms to do it. And none of these guys were from finance. They were all math professors. And what Jim did is he brought people in who had proven themselves as math professors or math scholars, and they basically refused to hire anybody who was an MBA or anybody from the finance world because they had the wrong assumptions. And what you learn as a mathematician is you go down to the foundation and you start with first principles, and then you reason your way up from there. So I think a core part of my innovation and productivity is that I do that, and I try to look at the foundation of theoretically what's going on here. But then the other half of it is I look at who are the most successful people, what are the patterns, what are the strategies, what are they doing, what are the causal pathways there, what really, just because somebody eats a certain cereal every morning, is that what causes their success, or is that just a coincidence? So you separate out what the causal factors are. And it's kind of a natural experiment, and you compare a bunch of people and look for the common factors. So that's my approach to this stuff. And so whenever I have a problem, I then try to create a system for it or find out the best strategies. And I take that dual approach of studying the top performers and looking at the theory and academic perspective on it, and then bring the two together, put out a course on it. I have a course, for example, called If You Can Cook, You Can Code, which just recently, so I think you mentioned the Udemy for Business thing earlier. So the top 2% of Udemy courses go into the Udemy for Business program. So Udemy has like 30 million plus students, and thousands and I think it's like 100,000 courses or something insane, but they're basically the YouTube of online courses. And so they take the top 2% of their courses and put them into a package that Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies pay for, and then their employees get free access to it. And so I think like something like 42 out of the Fortune 100 are subscribers to Udemy. And so they have access to my courses through that. And so I think at the peak it was 8, and then 1 came out for some reason. You get like 1 or 2 one-star reviews and it drops out. But 7 of my courses are in that program. So top 2%. And If You Can Cook, You Can Code is one of them. And people get really confused about like, what does it mean to code? Like, is this something I need to know? And coding is really as simple as learning Excel. You're learning functions, that's code. And then the data in the spreadsheet is data, and the functions operate on that data. And complex coding is just continually adding more complexity to that kind of basic combination of data and then functions or algorithms that operate on that underlying data and spit out new data. Everything reduces down to that. So I created that course because a cousin of mine asked me for advice on their 2 daughters and was like, well, how do we, what should we be teaching them about coding and programming computers? And I didn't think there was anything good out there. So that's kind of what I do, is I just go, and anytime I find something that I don't understand, or I don't think there's anything good out there, I create my learning project, I look at what's out there, and it's like, there's an opportunity here to create something that's better or that's different and could serve a different group. So that's how it all fits together.
What's your favorite productivity apps, and how do you use them?
So I'm big into OneNote. I've played around with Notion and Obsidian, and I create my courses to be, and I create templates for all the different major software. And I've always set the goal to create systems in each of these areas that are not dependent on a certain piece of technology. And this is part of your think about long-term roadmap of 10, 20, 50 years down the line. When you're really investing in your education, you're thinking about, where do I store my knowledge? And it's kind of like having your stocks stuck in a certain fund or a certain stock that you can't sell you can't move that money. And so that's a major issue. And so you don't want to have knowledge encoded in a software or in a format that you're not going to be able to use decades in the future. It's going to be very expensive to move. So I create my systems to be kind of agnostic as to which software you use, and I create templates and examples within all the major ones. So Evernote, OneNote, Obsidian, Notion. I've found more of my coaching clients recently have just been moving back to Microsoft Word, and some that will put a Word document or a Excel document in Google Drive to share it, but they keep it as a Word or an Excel file. And the reason why is because if you're using Google Docs, Google owns those documents, and you have to use this convoluted process to export them called Google Takeout that doesn't usually work 100%. And so it's a huge mess. So I recommend not just keeping your stuff in the cloud, having an offline component, and using something that's going to think about, is this software going to be around decades from now? And also, ideally, you don't want to be on a subscription model, because then they're going to the incentive is to lock you into their software. I think a major component is how good is the search engine within whatever thing you're using. So do you have the ability to find stuff quickly? And there's two ways to find things. You're either using the search engine, or you've got a classification system, or a, basically folder tree or folder structure, where anything related to this is going to be in this subfolder of this major folder. And so it's kind of the equivalent of, if you go to the library, you can search the library catalog for specific keywords and find titles, but you can also go to specific Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress category for that subject and then find all the books related to that. And people have over time shifted, I think, too much to just using the search engine in every situation, when in reality, a lot of times it's more efficient to go look at all the things in a certain category. And the ideal situation is you have the best of both worlds. You can search for things and find things easily with a search engine, but you also have a category system where if the search engine doesn't work, you have it as a fallback. And if you just want to find everything and you want to make sure nothing is left out and the search engine doesn't leave stuff out or make mistakes, you can find all the stuff in that one subfolder, and you know exactly where it is. You're never going to lose it. It's going to be there 10 years from now. And honestly, you can't, even if you had Google Power level search engines in all these programs, even Google misses really high quality stuff. So you can't trust the search engines. You have to have stuff also in a taxonomy, in a folder structure, and then use both of them so that you just get the best of both worlds. So that's the key. Those are some of the key things to think about with software. I use OneNote. OneNote's gotten better and better over time. And I just tell people, a lot of people, like I said earlier, they're already more productive than average. They get into the productivity space. They start learning from all these gurus about, here's this system, here's that system. And it becomes a thing where it's actually very much like watches. You want the complication, you want the tourbillon, you want the little kind of, you get into the movement and like all the complexities of the thing. And there's almost an arms race towards who can create the most complex thing. And the problem with that is more complexity doesn't necessarily make you more productive. It's kind of cool to like take a Lamborghini out on the track and put it through its paces, but that's not the most efficient way to necessarily get from point A to point B. So I find that a lot of people go down these rabbit holes of like, it's the equivalent of like creating a ship in a glass bottle. And you've moved away from creating the ship that's going to get you from point A to point B into creating a ship in a bottle, or just like over engineering something, because, and part of it is a procrastination thing. So here's another kind of dark side of productivity is part of what a lot of people are doing in productivity, or maybe not a lot of people, but a significant percentage. And this what explains if you're somebody who's very productive or into productivity, but find yourself procrastinating and getting off on these kind of bike shed projects where you're focused on the wrong thing. People will use productivity to procrastinate because they're in this quiet quitting category. Quitting has many forms. It's forms of not working hard, kind of slow walking things, not working as hard, focusing time on things that you enjoy instead of things that push the KPIs of the company. There's a lot of things people do to kind of get away from what they really should be doing, both in their personal life and professionally. And so if you find yourself getting really focused on, oh, I'm going to create this database, I'm going to create this complex system, you may actually be putting your energy there because you want to quit your job, or you want to go in a different direction. You're not fulfilled with your career. You're not fulfilled with something else. And so that can be a warning sign to you that there's actually, you really need to zoom out and there's a bigger thing. So really make sure you're focused on, does creating the productivity system or adding this complexity, does it really drive my important KPIs, key performance indicators? Or am I just kind of, it's almost becoming an art thing. It's becoming like you're an amateur sculptor, you're an amateur oil painter, and this, or you're an amateur watchmaker, and you're creating this complication as a piece of art. And if that's what it is, nothing wrong with that. But like, don't tell yourself that story when really, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But you're not really working on your productivity. You're working on this piece of art. And the other thing is, anything that's complex, you're going to have to maintain that. And it's like a yacht. The maintenance cost is, or really any boat, the maintenance cost is often going to be much larger than the cost of the actual thing over time. So the cost of creating the complexity, maybe medium, maybe low, maybe high, but the cost of maintaining that complexity over decades is going to be much larger than that. So it doesn't matter so much what you're doing to set things up. It matters, is this sustainable over decades? And you need to take that sustainability thinking and apply it to make sure that this is going to work very long term, because you're going to need to use this system very long term. And all this stuff, the kind of interesting thing that I found with the systems that I build and the stuff that I teach, is almost all of it is where society and just most people and the common knowledge is to do things short term and not think about the long term. And I've come in and said, if you really want the best long-term results, you need to set it up in this totally different way. And it may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but when you think in terms of decades, it's actually a lot cheaper.
And finally where should people go if they want to learn more about your material?
So I've got a YouTube channel, and we'll link to that down below. I'm actually giving away a lot of courses for free on Udemy. Sorry, not Udemy. Courses that were on Udemy, I'm giving them away for free on YouTube for a limited time. And so there's playlists on my YouTube channel where you can literally just watch those, and it's hours and hours of stuff. And there's also a bunch of interviews with top people in the productivity space: Tiago Forte, Scott H. Young, Prerak Juthani, who's doing MD, MBA at Stanford Medical and Stanford Business Graduate Business School. So the YouTube channel has a lot of stuff. And if you're interested in encyclopedic knowledge, encyclopedic learning, I have a huge series on that with a lot of unique content. If you're interested in the great books of the Western world, Encyclopedia Britannica, building up this kind of, I've done several interviews with top people, top YouTubers and academics on great classical works and how to build these very broad knowledge. So all that stuff's on the YouTube channel and is free. And there's a lot of those videos also have freebies where there's a free template or something attached to it. And then just go to timothykenny.com, Kenny, and that's my website. There's a thing on the homepage where you can sign up to my newsletter, get my free white paper on how I kind of my system for accelerated learning, and that's how you can find out about all the other new stuff that I have coming down the line. So, yeah,
that sounds great, and I hope that some viewers who are looking for productivity improvements and enhancements, whether it's for themselves or their children, get some good use out of that.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.